Welcome to Tenbury, known as the town in the orchard. My name is Howard Miller, and my hobby since retirement 15 years ago has been studying the history of Tenbury. With the help of local people, I have compiled 2 books of photographs of Tenbury and district over the last 100 years. I have written books on Tenbury in wartime, the pump rooms, pubs of Tenbury, and the Tenbury Church Guide. I have done a lot of guided tours of Tenbury for schools and societies and give talks on the history of Tenbury. I hope that you enjoy this tour and that you learn something of interest about our beautiful town. Tenbury Wells lies at the northwest corner of Worcestershire, near the borders with Herefordshire and Shropshire. It is called the town in the orchard with good reason, as it is still surrounded by cider apple orchards and hop yards. The name Tenbury comes from Tenbury, or the fort on the River Teme. The fort being what is now called the Castle Tump, lying now on the Shropshire side of the river. The Wells comes from the discovery of mineral water in some wells and the building of the spa building. Tenbury has been the river crossing of the Teme since the Iron Age. It will have connected forts like Clee Hill and Wall Hill north of the Teme with forts like Garmsley, Beach, which are south. With the coming of Christianity, the Anglo-Saxons settled here and built a church. The only piece remaining from this period is the Anglo-Saxon cross, which is kept in the church. After 900 AD, Tenbury was placed in the county of Worcestershire, in the hundred of Doddingtree, but was in the diocese of Hereford. The parish was divided into 4 hamlets: Tenbury Town, Tenbury Foreign, Berrington and Sutton. When the Normans came, they built the river bridge and formed Teme Street, dividing it up into burgage plots to be let out as shops. Lower Carewood. This view is taken from the top of Tyrrell's Lane. There can be seen New Court, or Bowlands as it was called, which was built as a dower house for the Godson family. Also in the background is Carewood House, the home of the Wheeler family, who owned a lot of property in Tenbury, including the Pembroke estate. The 2 farms in Lower Carewood are the probable site of the Priory of Cluniac monks, which were endowed with lands and a watermill. They spent most of the day in prayer. It is probable that stones from the priory were used to build the 2 ancient farms. There was a large carved stone called the Monastery Stone at the top of Carewood Hill in 1935. The town council gave orders that it should be placed in the burgage. But where is it now? Packhorse route. This used to be the main route to Worcester, and here it was known as Oatmeal Lane, which may have some connection with the monastery's watermill. We know there was a wooden bridge over the Keer. The present stepping stones were put in about 1950, using the old round wartime blocks that were supposed to stop tanks proceeding along the road. It is also likely that the route was part of the salt trail from the Chester area. We have a lane nearby called Saltbox Lane. The lane looks as though it was fairly heavily used, as it has sunk quite a bit. Also, there was a toll house by the Pembroke Inn in the 19th century to charge animals coming into the Tenbury market. Pembroke House. 60 acres, which included Pembroke House, were bought by Pembroke College, Oxford in 1687, the rent from which was to pay for research. The first innkeeper that we have a record of is Edmund Hill, Al's tailor, which was in 1600. His son, Philip Hill, Al's tailor, married Susan in 1628, and she was still in charge of the inn in 1683. Pembroke House was sold at auction in 1882 to E.V. Wheeler of Keerwood House. The site may have a longer history, for it is feasible that it was a parsonage to an Anglo-Saxon church and remained as glebe land until 1622, when Sir Thomas Lucy managed to get it released. And here we are at Gough School, so named after a gentleman called Edward Gough, a self-made man who was born in Herefordshire and made his money as a coal merchant in London. When he died, in his will, he left money for the promotion of schools in Herefordshire and adjoining counties. And that's how this school came to be built, with a grant from the will of Edward Gough. And here we are inside the Gough School. It was built in 1819 for a total cost of £130, £30 for the site and £100 for the cost of building the school. This isn't the original building. This was built in 1863 when the old one had gone into disrepair. So this classroom was in use from 1863 to about 1915. You can see the partition behind me on the roof. The school used to be divided into two classrooms with the curtains across. So it's not exactly the same type of schools as we get at the moment. And it was for the poor children of Tenbury. They had to pay a penny a week, or their parents had to find the money, and they got educated up to a certain standard. It was a Baptist school, and they were all Baptist ministers who were the teachers at the school. The present schoolroom was built in 1863 on the site of the original one. It is now used as the town museum. And here we've come out of a side door of the old school, and you can see what was their playground. not particularly big, just this little alleyway. At the bottom of the alleyway were the girls' and the boys' toilets. Baptist Church. The Baptist Church and the manse opposite was built in 1855. It was closed down in 1948 and was used as a community centre until the manse was pulled down for road widening. It is now used for industrial purposes, but still has a small graveyard at the rear of the building. First National School. Close by Goss School are 4 pebble-dashed cottages, numbers 43 to 49 Cross Street. These were the first national school, opened in 1829, for the education of the poor, united with promoting the principles of the established church. In 1854, the National School was built in Bromyard Road, now the Moore School, and the original school was sold to the Baptists. The present infant school was built in 1895, while Moore School was vacated by 1981. King's Head. This is a 17th century pub and one of 2 named after the Royalists in the Civil War. It is a half-timbered building and used to make its own beer when the smell was all over Cross Street. Cornwall House. This was built in 1690 by Thomas Cornwall, the 15th Baron of Burford, as a dower house for his wife Anne. The 16th and last Baron of Burford, Francis Cornwall, sold the house in 1709. He also sold off the manor of Tenbury. The shell porch is original, although it wasn't named Cornwall House until S.H. Godson bought it in 1850. In 1696, somewhere around about 8 years after this house was built, the government imposed a window tax on all the houses that had over 6 windows. To avoid paying this tax, you can see the bricked up windows. There are in fact 3 bricked up windows in this house. There's one at the end here, the south end, and 2 windows down. There's glass in front of it, is in fact another bricked up window, and there's one round the south end. So that was to avoid paying this window tax. The house is 1 room deep, and the parlour has an interesting shell alcove in which are 18th century paintings showing the costumes of that era. In the main bedroom is an original wig cupboard built into the chimney breast. And on the window is a poem scratched on by a young member of the Wood family in 1720. Tell me you, knowing, and where I may find a friend who dare stand by me, and then his love, he must be faithful, learned, who can too, and then it goes on unreadable. In the top of the staircase is a concealed money compartment, and as with many historical houses, there is supposed to be a secret tunnel to the church. Methodist Church, and at the rear the People's Hall. Tenbury was first missioned in the 1850s by 3 laymen from Ludlow who held open-air services. They encountered a good deal of opposition. They bought the site in Cross Street in 1863. Mr. Bevington of Ludlow built this first church as no Tenbury builders were interested. A passage had to be cut through one of the cottages to get to the church. The present church was built in 1894 after another cottage was bought. The old church at the rear was renamed the People's Hall. Round Market. Built in 1858 at the same time as the Corn Exchange. The architect was James Cranston. It was built at the time of the railway coming to Tenbury, and the gentry of the town, Lord Northwick, S.H. Godson, E.V. Wheeler, etc., wanted to improve the town's image. This new market had closed sides and was to improve the welfare of the farmers' wives selling butter and poultry. It had space for 150 baskets. There are still small auctions held here on a Tuesday morning. Bank House, Market Square. A nice block of Queen Anne period townhouses. They were built in the 18th century by Samuel Holland. Church Street used to be called All Hallows Street, but because of the influence of the Hollands, it became known as All Holland Street. This is about true, as he owned all the properties. The Cage. This used to be a public house. See the door with smoke room in etched glass. The name derives from a lock-up which used to be on the site and was used to house drunks overnight. Church. The first signs of Christianity in Tenbury is the fragment of a 9th century preaching cross, where early missionaries gathered their converts for instructing. The river was handy for baptizing. Next, there was an Anglo-Saxon church, probably on the same site as the existing one, but there are no remains. This church of St. Mary the Virgin, now called just St. Mary, was built in the 12th century. It is a building of red sandstone consisting of a tower, nave, north and south aisles, chancel, organ chamber and vestry. The only 12th century remains are the tower below the string course. The nave was destroyed in a flood in 1770, but wasn't satisfactorily renewed until the 1864 restoration. The west gallery inside the church was built by S.H. Godson out of the proceeds of the first year of operating the Tenbury Spa. The Acton tomb is the alabaster effigies of Thomas, who died 1546, and Mary, who died 1564, Thomas and Mary Acton of Sutton Park. Their only surviving child, Joyce, married Sir Thomas Lucy of Charlecott at the age of 12. It was he who prosecuted William Shakespeare for stealing deer. The Eastern Sepulchre is 14th century and was used to keep the cross and the host in over the Easter period. The stone hook on the upper left will have taken the Lenten veil across the chancel to hide the altar from public view. The Little Crusader, now in the Eastern Sepulchre, is a miniature effigy of a 12th century knight with a heart cupped in his hands. It is probably a Sturmey of Sutton, who died on the crusade, and they brought his heart back for burial. The plaque records the major flood of May 1886. It was just round the corner in some black and white cottages that are now pulled down that there was the only fatality in Tenbury. The water came up to the ceiling in the house of a crippled tailor and he couldn't get out. Royal Oak, a handsome black and white building of the 17th century. The first documentary evidence of the building is dated 1676, when it was sold to a Thomas Daly, a baker. There is an insurance document dated 1773 which says, "The insurance on Thomas Torrey's new house and brewhouse, named the Royal Oak Inn in Tenbury, would be £1 per annum." As was common with local pubs, you could take your meat in on a market day and they would cook it for you, adding potatoes and vegetables for a charge of sixpence. Until fairly recently, they had spirit pewter measures, which were used to seal corn deals between local farmers and merchants. This was one reason why the Corn Exchange wasn't so popular. There was a fairly disastrous fire in 1937 when the Robinson family were lucky to escape with their lives. Pump rooms. The first mineral waters were found in 1839 in a new well in the grounds of Septimus Godson's The Court. In 1854, a Mr. Hall, surgeon, took over the court and grounds in order to attract nobility and gentry to the pubs and pump rooms they had built by the stables. Mr. Hall's advertising literature of the time said, "The situation is most beautiful. The court adjoins the baths and pump rooms and is very suitable for invalids. The private gardens are very extensive." The first pump rooms had a beneficial effect on Tenbury, as money raised was used to light the town with gas and pave the principal streets. The present pump rooms were designed by Birmingham architect James Cranston and built in 1862. They were described as Chinese Gothic and were the first prefabricated buildings in England, the wrought iron sheets all being made in Birmingham. It was never very successful and went through various refurbishments before being closed in the Second World War. The exterior has now been renovated to bring it up to modern insulation standards, and the interior is being done and is due to be finished in October 2001. Country restaurant. Henry Hill Hickman lived here in 1829 until the time of his death. He was one of the pioneers to experiment with nitrous oxide as a means of relieving pain during surgical operations. He made incisions in animals, amputated ears and limbs without pain and with good surgical results. In 1824, he published a pamphlet, A Letter on Suspended Animation. Corn Exchange. Built in 1858, the architect again being James Cranston. It used to be approached by an arched corridor leading from an entrance archway of Bath stone with an illuminated clock. The entrance was decorated with figures of Ceres and Saturn, wreaths of hops, apples and wheat ears. Inside there was a dais at one end for the county magistrate and a dwelling house for a policeman with 2 lock-up cells. The Corn Exchange was supposed to be the place where farmers and merchants did business, but they still prefer to do their business in the public houses. The first cinema in Tenbury opened here in 1917 with a showing of The Goose Girl. This continued until 1937 when the present cinema was built. Regal Cinema. This cinema was built in 1937 on the site of two shops owned by W.H.B. Ashley. It was the brainchild of Mr. Robson, who was the proprietor of the Craven Arms Cinema. The interior was the work of the artist Mr. George Legg. It is said that when the vicar had a look at the cinema, he said there was no portrait of himself. The artist, duly obliged, looked carefully at the only monkey in the theatre. This is a typical burgage plot, and in the 1840s the shop front used to be a pub called Wilden's Pub, named after the owner, Samuel Wilden. And just on the ground around this spot, his workmen were digging foundations for a new brick building, and they uncovered two lead-lined canisters. They immediately opened them up, and out dropped a old hoard of silver coins, and none of them were later than the Civil War. And there were about 500 of those, and by the time Samuel Wilden arrived on the scene, there were about 400 left. The others had been dispersed. He took those coins down to London and had them valued, and the British Museum have now got them. And funnily enough, with the proceeds, he bought a house in Malvern and took his mistress to live with him in Malvern and left his wife here in Tenbury Wells. Council buildings. These were built in 1837 as a Tenbury Union workhouse, as required by the Poor Law Act of 1832. It was divided into two courtyards for men and women, divided by the kitchens and the dining room. In the front was the boardroom and living quarters for the workhouse master. There was room for 70 inmates, although 30 to 40 was the usual number. Trams were put up for the night on condition they spent the morning breaking stone for the highway. The mooring firm unravelled old hemp ropes to form oakum, used for caulking boats. One gentleman of the road was staying the night in the Union Infirmary, and he was wearing eel skins as gaiters, as he said they kept away cramp. He put the eel skins on the floor during the night, along with his bit of cake, only to find that by the morning they had all been eaten by mice. Union Infirmary. This was built in 1870, mainly with money supplied by Lord Northwick to celebrate his birthday, and was for the sick workhouse people. About 1894, an isolation hospital was built from a building supplied by Mrs. Baldwin Child of Keir Park. It had room for 2 males and 2 females. It was mainly used for hop pickers' children who brought their infectious diseases with them. Team Bridge. The 3 northern arches are part of the original 14th century bridge. Prior to the 16th century, the river used to go in a wide loop towards the Rose and Crown, leaving the Castle Tump on the south side of the river. At some time later, the river broke through to its present course, which meant 3 more arches had to be built on the south side at right angles to the new flow of the river. This accounts for the strange bend in the river. Cottage Hospital. This opened in 1869 thanks to the generosity of Arabella Prescott of Bockleton House. She bought Park Villa in Burford and converted it into a hospital, letting it free of rent for 1 year and also supplying the necessary medical instruments. In 1874, Lord Northwick purchased the hospital, with the town buying it from him in 1897 to commemorate the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria. The hospital had many ups and downs, mainly due to its financial situation. It had a major extension in 1935 with the help of the Rollo family. In 1943, Penloo, next door, was leased as a nurse's home, but the option to purchase was never taken up. In 1948, it came under the National Health Service. Fire engine. Before 1858, the fire engine was kept inside the church. Thomas Bangham raised a subscription to build a fire engine house by the church gates. The horses were kept at the Swan Hotel, and 22 men were needed to man the original manual pump. When the steam engine was purchased, they got up steam while they were waiting for the horses to come from the Swan. The new Team Street station, which was part of the old workhouse, was opened in November 1936, with the first fire being at the Wofferton sawmills. A new lighter fire engine was purchased in 1938, capable of pumping 500 gallons of water per minute. Its first fire was at the hop pickers barracks by the Talbot, Newnham Bridge. Canal. The Tenbury Canal was planned and built at the end of the 18th century. In January 1790, it was unanimously determined to proceed upon the business of building a canal from Kington to Stourport. By 1796, it had opened from Leominster to Mamble and went east to west just north of Tenbury. On the opening day, 14 boatloads of coal were brought from the collieries at Mamble to Leominster and sold for 15 shillings per tonne, which was about half price. The buildings still standing in Tenbury are the Wharf House along the Boriston Lane and the old toll house over the railway bridge on the Clee Hill Road. The best surviving part of the old canal is the Ray Aqueduct, which is near to Newnham Bridge. The canal was never very successfully and finally closed in 1859 when it was sold to the Shrewsbury and Hereford Railway. Tenbury Railway. The proposal to build a railway from Wooferton to Tenbury received royal assent in 1859. A condition was that the Shrewsbury and Herefordshire Railway should sell to them the Leominster Canal between Wolfton Wharf and Southnet Wharf. The single-track railway was built and opened in 1861. The proposal for the continuation of the railway from Tenbury to Bewdley received royal assent in 1860 and was opened in 1864. The railway was seen as a through route for rural districts west of the Shrewsbury and Hereford Railway to the industrial towns of the West Midlands. Due to beaching, the Wooferton-Tenbury section closed in 1961 and the Tenbury-Bewdley section in 1962, and both were closed to freight by 1964. In its heyday, which was about 1913, Tenbury had a staff of 13 and a new ladies' waiting room was built, together with extending the platforms and building new cattle pens. Free delivery of goods for up to a mile were made by horse and dray, while parcels were delivered by a porter with a handcart. Around this time, the station name was changed from Tenbury to Tenbury Wells.